Sarah Henderson stood at the gates of the Blackwood mansion, her weathered hands clutching a simple knitted shawl around her shoulders. At 72, her appearance was modest, grey hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a clean but well-worn dress that had seen better days. The contrast between her humble presence and the opulent estate before her couldn't have been starker. The mansion, with its manicured lawns and imposing stone facade, belonged to her grandson, Michael Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries. She'd watched from afar as he built his empire, transforming a small tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation. But today, gathering her courage, she'd finally decided to bridge the gap that had grown between them over the decades. As she pressed the intercom button, Sarah's mind drifted to the letter in her pocket, the one that had finally pushed her to make this journey. The cancer diagnosis gave her 6 months at most. Time, which had once seemed infinite, was now precious and fleeting. "Yes," a crisp, professional voice crackled through the speaker. "I'm here to see Michael Blackwood," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm his grandmother, Sarah Henderson." A long pause followed. Sarah could almost feel the confusion and skepticism from whoever was on the other end. Finally, the voice returned. "One moment, please." Minutes passed, and Sarah waited patiently, watching as expensive cars rolled past on the private drive, carrying what she assumed were business associates or family friends. Each one slowed slightly, their occupants casting curious glances at the elderly woman standing alone at the gates. Eventually, a sleek black car approached from inside the property. As it stopped, a woman emerged, Catherine Blackwood, Michael's wife. Sarah recognized her from Society magazine photos, though they'd never met. Catherine's Chanel suit and perfectly styled hair embodied everything about the world Sarah had never been part of. "Mrs. Henderson," Catherine said, her tone polite but cool. "This is unexpected. Michael is in meetings all day, I'm afraid. Perhaps you could call his office and schedule an appointment." Sarah straightened her shoulders, summoning the dignity that had carried her through decades of hardship. "I understand he's busy, dear, but I'm his grandmother, and I've come a long way. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." Catherine's perfectly manicured fingers tapped against her arm, a slight frown marring her features. "You understand, of course, that we need to be careful. Michael is a very prominent figure, and we often deal with people making claims of family connections." The words stung, but Sarah had expected this. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo album. "I have pictures here of Michael as a baby. His first steps, his first birthday. I was there for all of it. Before what exactly?" Catherine's tone sharpened. "If you're really his grandmother, where have you been all these years?" Sarah's heart ached at the question. The truth was complicated, wrapped in layers of sacrifice and silence that had protected Michael for decades. But now, with her time running out, those protective layers needed to be peeled away. "That's exactly what I need to discuss with him," Sarah replied softly. "There are things he needs to know, truths that have been buried for too long." Catherine studied her for a long moment, probably weighing the risks of letting this unexpected visitor into their carefully controlled world. Finally, she sighed. "Come with me, but I should warn you, Michael doesn't respond well to surprises, especially ones that might affect his family or business." As they walked toward the mansion, Sarah caught glimpses of the life her grandson had built. The Olympic-sized pool glinting in the sunlight, the garage housing a collection of luxury cars, the army of staff maintaining the grounds. It was a world away from the small apartment where she'd raised Michael's father, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table. Inside, the mansion was even more impressive. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, and priceless art adorned the walls. Catherine led Sarah to a formal sitting room where every piece of furniture looked too expensive to touch. "Wait here," Catherine instructed. "I'll see if Michael can spare a few minutes. But I should warn you, if this is some kind of attempt at—" "I'm not here for money," Sarah interrupted gently. "I've never needed his money. I'm here because time is running out, and there are truths he deserves to know. Catherine's expression flickered with something, curiosity, perhaps, or concern, before she turned and left the room. Sarah sat carefully on the edge of an antique sofa, her hands folded in her lap. On the mantel above the fireplace, family photos were displayed in silver frames. Michael and Catherine at their wedding, their children at various ages, vacation shots on yachts and at ski resorts. But there were gaps in this family history, empty spaces where other memories should have been. Sarah pulled out her own worn photo album, opening it to a particular page. There was Michael, at 2 years old, sitting on her lap while she read him a story. His father, James, stood behind them, young and proud before the accident that would change everything. And there, in the background, barely visible, was the man whose shadow had loomed over their lives for decades, Richard Blackwood, Michael's grandfather. The sound of approaching footsteps made Sarah close the album quickly. She looked up to see Michael standing in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space with the same commanding presence his grandfather had possessed. But while Richard's power had been wielded like a weapon, Michael's seemed to stem from something else, determination perhaps, or drive. "Grandmother," he said, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. His eyes, so like his father's, studied her with a mix of confusion and suspicion. "It's been a very long time." Sarah stood, her heart pounding. "Too long, Michael. But I'm here now, and there's something you need to know about your grandfather, your father, and why I disappeared from your life all those years ago." Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sarah saw Richard in him, the same way of holding tension, of preparing for unwelcome news. But then something softer flickered across his features, a glimpse of the little boy who used to fall asleep in her arms. "Why now?" he asked, his voice harder than she remembered. "After all these years of silence, why show up at my door today?" Sarah's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where the doctor's letter seemed to burn against her skin. But before she could answer, Catherine appeared behind Michael, their 3 children trailing curiously behind her. The youngest, a girl of about 7, peered around her father's leg with wide eyes. "Who is she, Daddy?" the little girl asked, and Sarah felt her heart constrict at how much she looked like James at that age. Michael hesitated, his gaze moving between his children and the grandmother they'd never known. "That's complicated, sweetheart. Why don't you go with Mom for now?" But as Catherine began to usher the children away, Sarah's hand trembled, and the photo album she'd been holding slipped from her grasp. It fell open on the floor, pages scattering, and among them fluttered something else, a yellowed envelope that had been hidden between the pages. Michael's eyes locked onto the envelope, and Sarah saw the moment he recognized his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The name Richard Blackwood was clearly visible on the aged paper, along with a date, just 1 week before the accident that had supposedly killed Michael's father. "What is that?" Michael demanded, his voice sharp with sudden interest. "What aren't you telling me about my father's death?" Sarah looked at the envelope, then at her grandson's face, seeing the first cracks in his carefully constructed world. "The truth," she said softly, "about why your grandfather really sent me away and why your father's accident wasn't an accident at all. This is just the beginning. What's coming next will change everything. Don't miss it." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fallen envelope, his eyes fixed on his grandfather's handwriting. The room seemed to hold its breath, Catherine hovering uncertainly in the doorway, the children's distant voices echoing from somewhere in the vast house, and Sarah watching her grandson with a mixture of fear and resolution. "Catherine," Michael said. "Michael," his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Make sure the children are occupied. This isn't something they should hear." Catherine hesitated only a moment before nodding and quietly closing the door behind her. Michael turned the envelope over in his hands, but before he could open it, Sarah spoke. "Your grandfather was not the man you think he was, Michael," she said softly. "Richard Blackwood built his fortune on secrets and lies, and your father, my son, discovered something he shouldn't have. Michael sank into a leather armchair, his usual commanding presence wavering. "My father died in a car accident," he said, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. The brake lines were faulty. It was investigated thoroughly. Sarah moved closer, her weathered hands clasping together. That's what Richard wanted everyone to believe. He was very good at making things appear exactly as he wanted them to. She gestured to the envelope. "Read it. Those are your father's words, written the week before he died." With careful movements, Michael opened the envelope. The paper inside was yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear, urgent strokes that spoke of haste and fear. As he began to read, Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that terrible week as if it were yesterday. "Dear Mother," Michael read aloud, his voice growing increasingly strained. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me. The documents I found in Father's study prove everything. The embezzlement, the fraudulent contracts, the offshore accounts where he's been hiding money stolen from his own company. But worse than that, I discovered what he did to Uncle Thomas." Michael's head snapped up. "Uncle Thomas, I was told he died before I was born." "Your father's younger brother," Sarah confirmed, her voice heavy with old grief. "Thomas was Richard's second son, and he was going to expose your grandfather's crimes. He disappeared in 1985, and Richard told everyone he'd moved to Europe. Your father never believed it." Michael continued reading, his face growing paler with each line. "Mother, Thomas didn't go to Europe. I found proof that Father arranged his own son's death because Thomas threatened to go to the authorities. And now that I know the truth, I fear I'm next. If anything happens to me, take these documents to the police. Keep Michael safe. Don't let Father do to him what he did to me and Thomas." The letter slipped from Michael's fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. This can't be true." Grandfather was strict, demanding maybe, but he wouldn't." His voice trailed off as Sarah opened her photo album again, pulling out another document. "Your father hid copies of the evidence in multiple places," she explained. "This is one of the bank statements he found, showing millions transferred to a Cayman Islands account the day after Thomas disappeared." Michael took the statement, his financial acumen allowing him to quickly grasp the implications. These transactions, they're structured to hide their true nature. It's a technique we still see today in money laundering operations. He looked up, his face haunted. "But if what you're saying is true, why didn't you go to the police after my father died?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because Richard gave me a choice that night. He came to my house after the accident while you were sleeping upstairs. He said I could either take the evidence to the police and watch you grow up in foster care while the scandal destroyed your future, or I could disappear with the evidence, and he would make sure you had every advantage in life." The weight of this revelation seemed to physically press Michael back in his chair. "You chose to disappear, to protect me. You were only 4 years old," Sarah whispered. "Your mother had died the year before and you'd just lost your father. I couldn't bear to see you lose everything else too. Richard promised you would want for nothing, the best schools, the best opportunities. He swore you would never know the struggle your father and I had known. So you just left me with him?" There was anger in Michael's voice now, decades of abandonment issues surfacing. "Left me with a man you knew was capable of murder. I made him sign a contract," Sarah replied, pulling out another document. "If anything happened to you, if he failed to provide everything he promised, all the evidence would automatically be sent to the authorities. It was the only insurance I had." She paused, her hand going to her chest. "And I never really left you, Michael. I moved to a small apartment across town, took a job as a cleaning lady at your school. I watched you grow up from a distance, making sure you were safe, that Richard was keeping his word." Michael stood abruptly, pacing the room. "I remember," he said suddenly, stopping by the window. "There was a cleaning lady at Brighton Prep who always smiled at me, who once gave me a cookie on my birthday when I was feeling lonely." He turned to Sarah, recognition dawning in his eyes. "That was you?" Sarah nodded, tears flowing freely now. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone. I was there, in the shadows, making sure you were okay. It broke my heart not to hold you, not to tell you who I was, but keeping you safe was more important than my own happiness. But why come forward now? Michael asked, his voice softer, the anger partially replaced by confusion. After all these years, why risk everything? Sarah's hand went to her pocket, where the doctor's letter waited like a ticking clock. But before she could answer, the door burst open. Catherine stood there, her face pale, holding her phone. "Michael," she said urgently, "the board is calling an emergency meeting. Someone's been accessing old company files, records from the 1980s. They're saying there's evidence of massive financial irregularities dating back to your grandfather's time." Michael's eyes snapped to Sarah. "Did you?" She shook her head. "No, but your father wasn't the only one who kept copies of the evidence. Thomas had a daughter, Michael, a daughter Richard never knew about, and she's been waiting all these years to expose the truth about what happened to her father." Michael staggered slightly, gripping the back of his chair. "I have a cousin. Her name is Rachel," Sarah said softly, "and she's the new head of internal audit at Blackwood Industries. She's been working there for 6 months, gathering evidence, preparing to bring everything to light." The sound of cars approaching drew their attention to the window. 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the mansion, and men in suits were emerging, members of the board, arriving for their emergency meeting. Michael looked at his grandmother, and for the first time, she saw something break in his carefully maintained facade. "How much time do I have?" he asked. "Before everything my grandfather built, everything I thought I knew about my family, comes crashing down." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "The truth always finds its way to the light, Michael. The only question is whether you'll be remembered as Richard's grandson, who perpetuated his lies, or James's son, who finally brought justice to our family." As the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the board members, Michael picked up his father's letter again, reading the final lines. "Remember, son, a man's legacy isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the truth he leaves behind. Don't leave yet. Don't. What comes next will leave you speechless." The Blackwood Mansion's formal dining room had been hastily converted into a makeshift boardroom. 14 of the most powerful people in corporate America sat around the mahogany table, their faces illuminated by the crystal chandelier above. Michael stood at the head of the table, his father's letter burning a hole in his pocket, while Catherine hovered near the doorway, tension visible in every line of her body. "These allegations are serious, Michael," Harrison Wells, the lead director, stated gravely. His silver hair and Brooks Brothers suit embodied old money and institutional power. "Financial records dating back 30 years show systematic fraud under your grandfather's leadership. The SEC will be involved by morning, and that's not all," Patricia Chen, the newest board member, added. She slid a tablet across the table. "The internal audit team, led by Rachel Turner, has uncovered evidence suggesting Richard Blackwood was involved in the death of Thomas Blackwood in 1985. Michael's fingers tightened on his chair. Rachel Turner, his cousin's married name. She had been right under his nose for months, methodically building her case. "Where is Miss Turner now?" Michael asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Here," the voice came from the doorway. A woman in her late 30s entered the room, her resemblance to Thomas Blackwood visible in the old photos Sarah had shown him. Striking and undeniable. Rachel Turner carried herself with the same quiet determination Michael remembered in his father. "Hello, cousin," Rachel said softly. "I think it's time we had a family reunion." The board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the personal drama unfolding before them. Michael studied Rachel's face, seeing echoes of his own features, the Blackwood bloodline evident in her strong jaw and piercing eyes. "The board will need time to review these allegations," Harrison Wells began, but Rachel cut him off. "The board has had 30 years, she said firmly. "My father was murdered for trying to expose the truth. Uncle James died for the same reason. The time for waiting is over. Michael felt the weight of every eye in the room. His entire life had been built on the foundation his grandfather laid, a foundation he now knew that was corrupt to its core. But before he could speak, there was a commotion in the hallway. Sarah appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed to her chest, her face pale. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice weaker than before, "but there's something else you all need to see." She stumbled slightly, and Michael rushed to support her. As he helped her to a chair, he felt how fragile she had become, how much the day's events had taken their toll. "Grandmother?" he asked worriedly, but Sarah was already pulling another envelope from her bag. "Richard didn't just keep evidence of his crimes," she said, her breathing labored. "He kept insurance. Names, dates, transactions. Every prominent family represented in this room had dealings with him. Some willing, some coerced, but all of them complicated." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Harrison Wells' face had gone ashen, while Patricia Chen was already reaching for her phone. "You're blackmailing us?" Wells demanded. "No," Sarah replied, her voice stronger despite her obvious fatigue. "I'm offering you a choice, the same choice Richard once offered me. You can either help us make this right, or you can watch everything you've built crumble under the weight of the truth." Rachel moved to stand beside Sarah, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "I've spent my entire life preparing for this moment," she said. "My mother died believing my father had abandoned us. I grew up watching the Blackwood family from afar, seeing the wealth and power that should have been shared with my father. But this isn't about money anymore. It's about justice." Michael looked around the room, seeing the fear in the board members' faces. These were people he'd known for years, mentors and colleagues who had helped shape his career. But how many of them had known the truth about his grandfather? How many had been complicit in maintaining the lies? "If we go public with this," Patricia Chen said carefully, "the company won't survive. Thousands of employees will lose their jobs. Pension funds will be decimated. The economic impact can be managed," Michael interrupted, surprising himself with his clarity of purpose. "But only if we act quickly and decisively." He turned to Rachel, really seeing his cousin for the first time. "You've been gathering evidence for months. You must have a plan." Rachel nodded slowly. "A complete restructuring. Transparent accounting of all past crimes. A significant portion of the company's profits dedicated to making restitution to those harmed by Richard's actions. And," she hesitated, glancing at Sarah, "a joint leadership structure. You and me working together to rebuild the company the right way." The board members exchanged worried looks, but Michael barely noticed. His attention was on Sarah, who had begun coughing quietly into a handkerchief. "Grandmother?" he asked again, more urgently this time. Sarah pulled the doctor's letter from her pocket with trembling hands. "I'm sorry, Michael. I wanted to tell you earlier, but there was so much else." As he read the diagnosis, Michael felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Stage 4. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months at most. His grandmother had come to him not just to reveal the truth about the past, but because she was running out of time. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. 3 weeks, Sarah replied. "When I got the diagnosis, I knew I couldn't take these secrets to my grave. You deserved to know the truth about your father, about why I left, and Rachel deserved the chance to clear her father's name." The room had gone silent, the corporate crisis momentarily overshadowed by this intimate family revelation. Catherine had moved closer, her earlier suspicion of Sarah replaced by genuine concern. Rachel spoke first, her voice thick with emotion. "All these years, you've been carrying this burden alone, watching over Michael, protecting the evidence, keeping our family's secrets." "Not anymore," Michael said firmly. He stood, addressing the board with newfound authority. "My grandfather built this company on lies, manipulation, and murder. He forced my grandmother to choose between justice and my future. He robbed my cousin of her father and her birthright. Those choices end today." Harrison Wells leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Everything," Michael replied. "Full disclosure, complete transparency. Rachel and I will lead the company together through this transition." Those who help us make it right can be part of the solution. Those who resist, he gestured to the evidence Sarah had brought, will face the consequences of their past choices. As the board members began heatedly discussing the proposal, Michael knelt beside his grandmother's chair. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "All these years, you were right there watching over me, and I never knew." Sarah cupped his cheek with a trembling hand. "You know now. That's what matters." But before Michael could respond, Sarah's hand fell away, her eyes rolling back as she slumped in her chair. "Call an ambulance!" Michael shouted, catching her as she fell forward. Grandmother, please!" As chaos erupted in the boardroom, with Catherine already on the phone with emergency services and Rachel rushing to help, Michael held his grandmother's frail form, feeling her pulse flutter weakly beneath his fingers. After 30 years of watching from the shadows, Sarah had finally stepped into the light, but at what cost? Don't forget to follow us to keep exploring stories that inspire and move you. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the private room where Sarah Henderson lay, looking small and fragile against the white sheets. Michael sat beside her bed, his suit jacket discarded, tie loosened, holding her weathered hand in his. The past 48 hours had been a blur of emergency rooms, doctors' consultations, and crisis management meetings. "The cancer has spread more aggressively than we initially thought," Dr. Roberts had explained earlier, her voice gentle but firm. "The stress of recent events has accelerated her decline. I'm sorry, but we're looking at weeks now, not months." Outside the hospital room, the world was in chaos. News of the Blackwood scandal had broken that morning, sending the company's stock plunging and triggering a SEC investigation. But here in this quiet room, watching his grandmother's chest rise and fall with each labored breath, Michael found clarity he'd never known before. Rachel entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She'd barely left the hospital, working remotely from the family waiting room, coordinating with lawyers and PR teams between visits to Sarah's bedside. Despite being strangers just days ago, she and Michael had fallen into an unexpected rhythm of cooperation. "The board has agreed to our terms," she said softly, handing Michael a cup. "Full disclosure, supervised restructuring, and the restitution fund. Harrison Wells is actually being surprisingly helpful now that he's on board." Michael nodded absently, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "She sacrificed everything for me," he murmured, "gave up her own happiness, lived in poverty, just to keep me safe. And how did I repay her? By becoming exactly what my grandfather wanted me to be, focused on profit, blind to the human cost." "You didn't know," Rachel said, taking the seat opposite him. "None of us knew the full truth. But we know now, and we're making it right. That's what matters." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Catherine entered, looking exhausted but determined. She'd spent the past 2 days managing the children's confusion and fear while helping Michael navigate the crisis. "The lawyers have finished reviewing the evidence Sarah preserved," she said quietly. "It's extensive. Richard didn't just document his own crimes. He kept detailed records of every deal, every partner, every compromise. The whole network of corporate corruption in this city leads back to him. He was building an empire of secrets," Michael replied bitterly, "using people's shame and fear to control them, just like he tried to control Sarah." Sarah stirred slightly at the sound of his voice, her eyes fluttering open. "Michael?" she whispered. "I'm here, grandmother," he said quickly, leaning closer. "I'm right here." Sarah's grip on his hand tightened weakly. "The children, are they? They're safe," Catherine assured her, moving to the bedside. "They've been asking about you. Emma, our youngest, she made you a card. She says you remind her of her favorite fairy godmother." A faint smile touched Sarah's lips. "I would have loved to be a proper grandmother to them." "You will be," Michael insisted, fighting back tears. "For whatever time we have left, you're part of our family. No more shadows, no more distance." Sarah's eyes moved to Rachel. "Your father would be so proud of you. You have his strength, his determination to do what's right." Rachel wiped away tears. I wish I had known him. Shh. Known you, all these years. Tell me, Sarah said, her voice growing weaker, what will happen now? To the company, to everything Richard built? Michael and Rachel exchanged glances. It was Michael who answered, his voice firm with conviction. We're going to transform it, he said. Rachel and I will lead the company together, but with a new mission. The restitution fund will help those harmed by grandfather's actions. We're establishing scholarships in Uncle Thomas's name, support programs for whistleblowers, ethics training programs. The Blackwood name will stand for something different now, Rachel added. Something honest, something good. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Your father, he always said the truth would come out eventually. That lies were like chains, weighing down the soul. Her voice trailed off as another coughing fit seized her. Michael helped her sip water, his heart breaking at how frail she had become. When she could speak again, Sarah turned to Catherine. The photo album in my bag. Catherine retrieved it quickly, placing it in Sarah's lap. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it to a page Michael hadn't seen before. There, carefully preserved, was a photograph of his father and Uncle Thomas as young men, standing together in front of the original Blackwood office building. They were going to run the company together, Sarah explained softly. Before Richard's greed destroyed everything, they had such dreams, such plans to do good in the world. Her hands shook as she tried to turn the page, and Michael helped her. The next photograph showed Sarah holding him as a baby, his father beaming proudly beside them. I kept these all these years, Sarah whispered. Memories of what could have been, what should have been. A nurse entered quietly, checking Sarah's vital signs with practiced efficiency. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Michael could read the concern in her eyes. Mrs. Henderson needs rest, she said gently. Perhaps just one visitor at a time for now. Before anyone could respond, Sarah's monitor began beeping more rapidly. Her hand clutched Michael's with surprising strength. Promise me, she gasped, her eyes suddenly intense. Promise me you'll do what your father and Thomas wanted. Make things right. I promise, Michael said firmly, squeezing her hand. Rachel and I both promise. We'll rebuild everything the right way this time. Sarah's eyes moved between them, taking in her grandchildren's faces as if memorizing them. Then I can rest, knowing the truth is finally free. Her voice faded as her eyes drifted closed, the monitors beeping, slowly steadying. The nurse adjusted her oxygen and medications, ensuring she was comfortable. She's sleeping now, the nurse explained softly. The next few days will be critical. She'll need all her strength. As the nurse left, Michael stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the gathering dusk. Somewhere out there, his grandfather's carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling. Lives were being upended, careers destroyed, reputations ruined. But here in this quiet room, watching his grandmother sleep, Michael understood something his grandfather never had. True legacy isn't built on power or fear, but on love, sacrifice, and the courage to face the truth, no matter the cost. Rachel joined him at the window, her presence a quiet reminder of all that had been lost and all that might yet be saved. We have a lot of work ahead of us, she said softly. Michael nodded, his voice equally quiet but filled with determination. Yes, we do, and we'll do it right this time, for them, for all of them. In her sleep, Sarah smiled faintly, as if she could hear their words, their commitment to the truth she had protected for so long. Outside the hospital windows, storm clouds gathered, promising to wash the city clean. Every story has a lesson. If you don't want to miss the next ones, join our community. 3 months later, the autumn sun streamed through the windows of the newly renamed Thomas Blackwood Memorial Conference Center. Where Richard Blackwood's portrait had once dominated the wall, a new installation stood, photographs of Thomas and James Blackwood, along with newspaper clippings documenting the company's transformation and commitment to corporate ethics. Michael stood at the podium, Rachel by his side, addressing a room full of employees, press and industry leaders. Sarah, in a wheelchair but dressed elegantly, sat in the front row with Catherine and the children. Though visibly frail, her eyes were bright with pride. 30 years ago, Michael began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, two brothers had a vision for this company. They believed business could be both profitable and ethical, that success shouldn't come at the cost of human dignity. Today, we honor that vision by announcing the launch of the Blackwood Truth and Reconciliation Initiative. Rachel stepped forward, her professional demeanor softened by emotion. This program will not only provide restitution to those harmed by past corporate practices, but will also establish the largest corporate whistleblower protection fund in the country. No employee should ever have to choose between their conscience and their livelihood. The announcement was met with applause. But Michael's attention was fixed on Sarah. Over the past months, she had fought hard, outliving the doctor's predictions through sheer determination. She'd wanted to see this day, to witness the company's transformation with her own eyes. Emma, Michael's youngest, sat beside her great-grandmother, holding her hand. The two had formed an immediate bond, with Sarah telling Emma stories of her father as a little boy, passing down the family history that had been hidden for so long. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and reporters gathered soundbites, Michael helped Sarah onto the building's rooftop garden. It was a new addition, part of the company's environmental initiatives, but today it served a more personal purpose. "Your father proposed to your mother here," Sarah said softly, looking out over the city. "Thomas used to grow tomatoes in pots by that corner. They had such plans for this place." Michael squeezed her shoulder gently. "And now those plans are becoming reality. The company's new direction, the ethics initiatives, the community programs. It's all because of you, grandmother, because you kept the truth alive." Sarah smiled, though her eyes were tired. "No, Michael. It's because you and Rachel chose to be better than your grandfather. You chose truth over power, healing over profit." Rachel joined them carrying a small wooden box. "The last of the restitution payments went out today," she reported. "Every family affected by Richard's actions has been contacted and compensated." And she opened the box, revealing an old key. "We found it, the original deed to your house, the one Richard forced you to sell. We've bought it back." Sarah's hands trembled as she touched the key. "My little house, where I raised James, where Michael took his first steps. It's yours again," Michael said softly. "We've had it restored, exactly as it was. You can go home, grandmother." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "Home," she whispered. "After all these years." Catherine appeared in the doorway, the children trailing behind her. "The car's ready whenever you are, Sarah. The doctors said a short visit should be fine, as long as you don't overtire yourself." The drive to Sarah's old house was quiet, filled with anticipation. When they pulled up to the modest two-story home, Sarah's breath caught. The white picket fence had been repainted, the garden replanted with her favorite roses. Wind chimes, exactly like the ones she'd had 30 years ago, tinkled softly in the breeze. Michael helped her up the front walk, supporting her gently. Emma skipped ahead, excitedly pointing out the bird bath and the flowering dogwood tree. Inside, Sarah walked slowly from room to room, touching familiar walls, smiling at carefully restored details. In the living room, a new photo wall had been created, filling in the decades of family history that had been lost. Pictures of James and Thomas as children, Sarah with baby Michael, and new photos of the entire family together, the past and present finally united. "Look, great-grandma!" Emma called out, pointing to a framed document hanging in a place of honor. It was the original corporate charter for Blackwood Industries, signed by both James and Thomas, with their mission statement clearly visible: to build a company that serves humanity with integrity, compassion, and truth. Sarah sank into her old rocking chair, restored and waiting for her, as Emma climbed into her lap. "Tell me again," the little girl asked, "about Daddy when he was little, about his father and Uncle Thomas." Sarah gathered her granddaughter close, looking around at her family: Michael and Catherine, Rachel and her husband, the other children sprawled on the floor nearby. Here, in this house filled with memories both old and new, she finally felt at peace. "Well, sweetheart," she began, her voice warm with love and remembrance. "It all started right here, in this very room, where two brothers dreamed of building something wonderful." As Sarah's voice filled the room with stories of the past, Michael stood by the window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold. The company's transformation was well underway, its future secure in the partnership he and Rachel had forged. But more importantly, here in this modest house, surrounded by love and truth, the real Blackwood legacy was finally taking root. Later that evening, as the family prepared to take Sarah back to the hospital, she held Michael's hand tightly. "I can go now," she whispered, "knowing everything is as it should be. The truth is out, the family is whole, and love has won over fear." Michael kissed her forehead gently. "We are not ready to let you go yet, grandmother. There are still so many stories to tell, so many moments to share." Sarah smiled, touching his cheek. "I'll stay as long as I can, my dear boy, but remember, the greatest legacy isn't in buildings or bank accounts. It's in the truth we choose to live, the love we choose to give, and the courage to right the wrongs of the past." As they helped Sarah into the car, Emma pressed a hand-drawn picture into her great-grandmother's hands. It showed their entire family, standing together in front of the house, with words carefully printed across the top, "Our family's true home." Sarah hugged the picture to her chest, her eyes meeting Michael's in the rearview mirror. In that moment, they both understood that while Richard Blackwood had built an empire of lies, Sarah Henderson had built something far more precious, a legacy of love, truth, and redemption that would echo through generations to come. The autumn breeze stirred the wind chimes as they drove away, their gentle music a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of courage, love, and the unwavering belief that truth, no matter how long buried, will always find its way into the light. What would you have done in Michael's place when discovering such a powerful truth about your past? Would you risk everything you've built to make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspective on these life-changing moments. And here's another question that's been on my mind. How far would you go to protect someone you love? Would you make the same sacrifice Sarah did, giving up your own happiness to keep your family safe? Let me know in the comments. Your insights always spark such fascinating discussions. If this story touched your heart and made you think, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. New stories that will move you just as deeply are waiting for you every week. Speaking of which, see that video on your left? Trust me, you won't want to miss it. It explores another powerful journey of truth, sacrifice, and redemption that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. Click it now and prepare for another emotional roller coaster that will stay with you long after it's over.